The wagon came fast around the bend, iron-shod wheels grinding against the hard-pan street, and Grace Holloway heard it before she saw it, and the thunder of hooves striking earth, at the rattle of timber and metal, the driver's shout splitting the cold morning air like an axe through kindling. She tried to move, but the burlap sack strapped to her back pulled her sideways like an anchor dragging her under dark water. Her boot heel caught in the torn hem of her dress. She went down hard palms, scraping dirt. And when she looked up, the world had narrowed to two enormous draft horses bearing down on her with foam flying from their bits and their eyes rolling white with panic or indifference. She could not tell which, and it did not matter because she was about to die in the street of a town whose name she had come to hate more than any word in the English language. There was no time to scream, no time to pray. Only the certainty that this was how it would end, crushed under iron wheels and unforgiving hooves, her body left in the dust for the dogs to worry. A shadow crossed her vision. A man appeared between her and the horses, as though he had materialized from the very air itself. He caught the bridle with both hands and wrenched the team aside with a strength that seemed to defy the laws of physics and common sense. The horses reared hooves, slashing the air inches from Grace's face, close enough that she felt the wind of their passing and smelled the sharp tang of sweat and iron and fear. The wagon skidded sideways, tilted so far that for one impossible moment it seemed it must overturn, then somehow righted itself. The driver cursed and fought the reins, his knuckles white as bone. Grace could not breathe. Her chest was locked tight, her heart hammering so violently she tasted copper at the back of her throat, like she had bitten through her own tongue. She tried to stand, and her legs would not obey. She fell back to her knees, the burlap sack crushing her shoulders, tin pots and kettles inside, clanging like a funeral bell tolling for someone already dead and buried. The man who had saved her life stood between her and the horses, utterly still. He was Lakota. She knew that immediately, from the way he wore his hair in two long braids, black as riverstone from the cut of his buckskin shirt, worn soft at the elbows, and darkened by long travel and hard use from the moccasins on his feet that made no sound even on the packed earth. He was perhaps 30 years old, broad across the shoulders and lean through the waist, and he carried himself with the kind of perfect stillness that spoke of patience and danger held in equal measure. A rifle was slung across his back, and the wood dark with age and oil. A knife rested at his belt in a plain leather sheath that showed the wear of constant use. He did not look at the driver. He looked at the horses until they settled, blowing hard through their nostrils, and only then did he release the bridle. Around them, coal dust held its breath. Miners froze in mid-stride, their faces already gray with the coal dust they breathed from dawn until dark, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Storekeepers appeared in doorways, like cautious animals emerging from burrows, hands drifting toward the revolvers they kept behind their counters. The morning light turned harsh and unforgiving, every shadow sharp-edged as a razor. The air itself seemed to thicken with hostility, pressing down on Grace's shoulders with almost physical weight. An Indian, alone, standing in their street. Grace tried to stand again. This time she made it halfway before her knees buckled. She grabbed at the man's sleeve to keep from falling, her fingers small and white against his sun-darkened skin, and when she looked up at him, she saw eyes so dark they seemed black, unreadable, as river stones smoothed by centuries of water flowing over them. Blood ran from her split lip into her mouth, warm and metallic. Her hands shook so badly she could not make them stop, could not make them do anything except cling to this stranger's arm, as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried very hard to kill her and might yet succeed. She had no money, no family, no prospects, no hope. She had nothing left to bargain with except the truth, and so she spoke it because there was nothing else left to speak. "I'm not worth much, sir." she said, her voice cracking on the words like thin ice breaking under too much weight. "But I can cook. If you get me out of this town, I'll cook till my hands give out. I swear it on whatever you hold sacred." The man looked down at her for a long moment without speaking. His expression did not change by so much as a flicker. Then he lifted the burlap sack from her back with one smooth motion, as though it weighed no more than a child's toy, and settled it on his own shoulder. The sudden absence of weight nearly toppled her. She grabbed his forearm to stay upright, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and he did not pull away. He simply stood there, silent and solid as granite, while she remembered how to breathe. From the porch of the Silver Knife Saloon, a door swung open on rusted hinges that shrieked like something dying. Mortimer Pike stepped into the sunlight. He was not a tall man, but he filled the doorway as completely as a cork fills a bottle, broad across the chest and thicker through the middle. His vest straining against its buttons, a gold watch chain gleaming across his belly like a symbol of prosperity and power and ownership. When he smiled at Grace, his teeth were very white against his wind-burned face, and the smile did not reach his eyes at all. "Now, friend," Pike said, his voice carrying across the street with the false warmth of a saloon keeper greeting a new customer with money in his pockets. He descended the steps slowly, deliberately, each boot strike against the wooden planks, a statement of ownership and control. "That girl there belongs to me. She's got a legal contract signed and witness proper. She walks off before her debts are paid. That's theft of services under territorial law. I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you're interfering with a legitimate business arrangement." Noden, though Grace did not yet know his name, did not move. He met Pike's gaze without blinking, and when he spoke, his English was careful and precise, each word placed like a stone in a wall that could not be knocked down by wind or water or the weight of years. "She is not property. No person can be property. Show me your paper if you claim to own her." Pike's smile thinned until it was nothing but a line carved across his face with a dull knife. The contracts were locked in his office safe, wrapped in oilcloth, to protect them from moisture and prying eyes, and bringing one out would mean admitting in writing what everyone in coal dust already knew, but pretended not to see: that Mortimer Pike trafficked women through fraudulent marriage advertisements and manufactured debts, and that he moved them like livestock when they became troublesome or unprofitable. Worse, if he shot a Lakota warrior in broad daylight with half the town watching the bands camped upriver, might stop raiding his competitors' ore wagons and start raiding his own. The investors back east who financed his operation were already nervous about what the newspapers called Indian troubles. A dead warrior in the middle of town would require explanations that Pike could not afford to give, not if he wanted to keep the money flowing. So Pike laughed instead, a short and ugly sound like a saw biting through green wood. "This is between me and my employee. I suggest you move along before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. We've got laws in this territory, and they don't look kindly on folks who interfere with binding contracts." Noden's voice dropped half a tone quiet, as stone scraping against stone in the deep places under the earth. "I do not see law here. I see a man who steals women and calls it business." The insult landed like a physical blow. Behind Pike, bitter, Sam shifted his weight, his good hand, the one that was not splinted and bound, moving toward the revolver on his hip. Two more of Pike's men appeared in the doorway, their faces shadowed and hard. Men in doorways up and down the street touched their own weapons, fingers curling around grips and triggers. The air itself seemed to contract, squeezing tighter and tighter until something had to break. Then Pike raised one hand palm out, and his men froze like hunting dogs called to heel. He smiled again, showing all his white teeth. "We'll settle this proper. he said, his voice pleasant and conversational, and utterly without warmth. Later, he turned and walked back into the Silver Knife Sam and the gunmen, following like shadows, following their source. Only one man remained on the porch, lean and still with gray eyes that tracked every movement in the street with the focused attention of a wolf studying prey. Fitzgerald. Grace would learn his name later. But in that moment, she knew him only as danger, as the kind of man who could follow you for days without your ever knowing he was there, and the kind who never missed what he aimed at, and never asked questions about what happened to the people he delivered. Noden turned his back on them, a calculated insult in any language, and walked Grace Holloway down the street toward the eastern edge of town. Every step took them farther from Pike's immediate reach. Every step made it harder for Pike to reclaim her without starting the violence he was trying to avoid. Grace kept her eyes on the ground and her hand on Noden's arm, as though he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried very hard to kill her and might yet succeed. Behind them, unseen by either of them, Fitzgerald lit a thin cigarette and considered what he had just witnessed. His orders from Pike were simple: find the Indian and the girl, bring them back, and do not leave marks that would be hard to explain. But Fitzgerald had learned over 15 years of hunting fugitives that orders changed quickly when situations collapsed, and every instinct he had developed over those 15 years was screaming that Mortimer Pike was standing on the edge of a cliff without realizing the ground was already crumbling beneath his boots. Dr. Albert Green's office occupied a narrow clapboard building at the eastern edge of coal dust, wedged between a feed store that had been closed for 2 years and an abandoned livery stable with a roof that was slowly caving in under its own weight. The sign above the door read, A. Green Physician, in letters that had once been painted gold, but were now faded to the color of old bone, bleached by sun and wind. Inside, the office smelled of carbolic acid and tobacco smoke, and something herbal that might have been medicine, or might simply have been the accumulated odor of hope, deferred and suffering endured. Green himself was in his middle 50s, with gray threading through his brown hair like silver wire through copper, and permanent nicotine stains on the first 2 fingers of his right hand. When Noden pushed through the door with Grace leaning heavily on his arm, Green looked up from the week-old newspaper he had been reading, and his expression did not change by so much as a flicker. "Put her on the table," he said, already reaching for his medical bag with the automatic efficiency of a man who had patched up more injuries than he cared to remember. Noden guided Grace to the examination table, a scarred wooden surface covered with a sheet that might once have been white, but was now the color of old snow after the coal smoke has settled on it. She sat heavily swaying like a sapling in wind. Green tilted her chin up with one tobacco-stained finger to examine the split lip, then checked her pupils by holding a candle close to her face. Checked her pulse at throat and wrist, examined the dark bruises circling her wrists like manacles of flesh and bone. "Anything broken?" he asked, his voice professionally neutral. Grace shook her head. Her voice came out thin and unsteady. "Just shaken, I think. And tired. So tired." "You're awful lucky he was there." Green turned to Noden, his eyes sharp and assessing. "And you're either very brave or very foolish. Pike doesn't forget insults, and he has a reach that extends farther than you might think." "Then he will have much to remember," Noden said. Green almost smiled. He poured water into a chipped porcelain basin, dampened a clean cloth, and handed it to Grace. "Clean your face. Then you can tell me why Mortimer Pike thinks he has a claim on you and what you plan to do about it." So Grace told them. She spoke in a low, halting voice while she scrubbed dried blood from her chin, and the words came slowly at first, and then faster, as though a dam had broken somewhere inside her. And everything she had been holding back for 4 months came pouring out in a flood she could not control, and did not want to. The advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper. The contract with Thomas Marsh's name forged at the bottom in careful copperplate script. The manufactured debts that appeared from nowhere, growing like mushrooms in darkness. The locked pantry where she slept with mice chewing holes through her boots, and the door bolted from the outside each night. The beatings when she moved too slowly, or spoke too sharply, or simply existed in a way that displeased bitter Sam. The women who vanished without explanation, and the lies Pike told about where they had gone. She told them about the girl Sam had been beating this morning, a thin, frightened creature with haunted eyes, who had arrived on yesterday's stagecoach, carrying the same desperate hope Grace had carried 4 months earlier. She told them how she had watched Sam raise his fist again, and how something inside her that had been bending and bending and bending for months had finally snapped clean through like a tree branch loaded with too much ice. "I know I can't stay here." She finished, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He'll come for me. Tonight, tomorrow, whenever he thinks he can take me without witnesses. And I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have any money. I don't have anything except—" She gestured helplessly at herself, at her torn dress, and her bleeding hands, and her split lip. "This. You can stay here tonight," Green said. He glanced at Noden, one eyebrow raised in silent question. "Both of you if need be, but after that we bring Pike to justice." Noden said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Both of them turned to look at him. Grace's eyes were wide and disbelieving, as though he had just suggested they fly to the moon. Green's eyes were narrowed with something that might have been amusement, or might have been despair, or might have been the weary resignation of a man who has seen too many good intentions ground into dust under the boot heel of reality. "Justice!" Green's voice was flat, toneless. "Pike owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He probably owns half the territorial government in Cheyenne. What justice do you think exists in a place like this?" "Then we make justice," Noden said simply, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Or we make the truth loud enough that justice has no choice but to come and see what is happening." Grace stared at him, something stirring in her chest, not hope, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what hope had felt like before coal dust had beaten it out of her. "You don't even know me. Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Noden looked at her for a long moment before answering. And when he spoke, there was no cruelty in his voice, only the absolute honesty of a man who did not know how to lie, even when a lie would have been kinder. "I did not come here for you. I came because Pike is poisoning the Snake River. My people are dying, children and elders and everyone between. The fish are dead. The game has left. The water tastes of metal and poison. Your suffering and theirs come from the same source, like two branches growing from the same rotted root. So we will cut down that root together, or we will fail together. But I will not leave while he continues to poison the water and steal women." He turned to Green. "You saved my cousin 3 winters ago, pulled a bullet from his shoulder and sent him home when other white doctors would have let him die or turned him over to the soldiers at the fort. That kindness is known among my people. That is why I came to you first, because I know you are not like Pike and his men." Green was quiet for a long moment, his nicotine-stained fingers drumming against the examination table in a rhythm that might have been thought or might have been memory. Then he sighed and reached for his tobacco pouch, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're going to get us all killed," he said. But he did not tell them to leave, and when he lit his pipe, his hands were steady. That night, Grace woke to the sound of breaking glass. She sat bolt upright in the narrow cot Dr. Green had set up for her in his back room, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack under the strain. Voices in the front office, low and angry and unmistakably male. Boots on floorboards. The scrape of furniture being shoved aside with the casual violence of men who expected no resistance. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet she had taken to keeping by the bed, a habit learned in the Silver Knife kitchen, where you never knew when you might need to defend yourself, and moved toward the door on bare feet that made no sound on the cold wood. The door burst open before she reached it, slamming back against the wall with enough force to shake the building. Bitter Sam filled the doorway like a malevolent spirit made flesh. His broken hand was wrapped in a filthy bandage that looked as though it had not been changed in days, and his good hand held a revolver that looked enormous in the lamplight. Behind him crowded two more of Pike's men, their faces shadowed and mean, their intentions written in every line of their bodies. "This is Pike's property," Sam said, leveling the revolver at Grace's chest. His words were slightly slurred whiskey probably, or laudanum for the pain in his shattered hand, or both. "You come quiet, and maybe we don't hurt the doc. You fight, and we burn this whole place down with all three of you inside. Your choice." Grace raised the skillet like a shield, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Sam laughed, a wet and ugly sound, like water going down a blocked drain. "That's what they all say, right up until they realize nobody's coming to save them." He stepped forward, reaching for her with his bandaged hand. Grace swung the skillet with everything she had, with 4 months of rage and fear and humiliation behind it. The cast iron connected with his gun hand, a solid ringing impact that sent the revolver spinning across the floor and into the corner, where it discharged into the ceiling, showering them all with plaster dust. Sam howled and lunged at her, his good hand reaching for her throat. The rear window exploded inward in a spray of glass and moonlight and cold night air. Noden came through like a force of nature given human form, rolling to his feet between Grace and the men before they could react to his presence. He did not try anything elaborate or showy. The room was too small for theatrics, the angles too tight for anything except brutal efficiency. He simply drove his shoulder into the nearest man's chest, with all his weight and momentum behind it, lifting the man clear off his feet and slamming him into the wall hard enough that the plaster cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The man's head bounced off the wood with a sound like a melon dropped on stone, and he slid down, leaving a red smear eyes rolling back to show the whites. Sam scrabbled for his fallen revolver with his broken hand, screaming as the shattered bones ground together, his face twisting into a mask of agony and rage. Before he could reach the weapon, Noden kicked it away with one moccasined foot and followed through with a short, brutal punch to Sam's floating ribs. Something cracked bone or cartilage, impossible to say which. Sam folded over, gasping like a landed fish, drowning in air. The third man drew a knife from his boot, a long and wicked-looking blade that caught the lamplight and threw it back in wicked gleams. Noden caught his wrist as the knife came up, twisted hard enough that tendons creaked and bones ground together, and drove the man's own blade into the wooden door frame with such force that the handle quivered like a tuning fork struck against stone. The man jerked his hand free and stumbled backward through the office, cradling his wrist and making small, wounded sounds. Sam staggered to his feet, his face twisted with pain and fury, and something darker, the kind of rage that comes when a man realizes he has been bested by someone he considers less than human. "Pike'll burn this place down with all of you inside." He spat through bloody teeth. "You think you're safe because you got an Indian protecting you. Pike'll hang him from the cottonwood tree in the town square and make you watch while he chokes. And then he'll take you back to the kitchen and make sure you never forget what happens to girls who run." Then he lurched after his companion, out through the office and into the night, leaving the unconscious man slumped against the wall, and the knife still quivering in the door frame like a promise of violence deferred but not forgotten. Silence fell, broken only by Grace's ragged breathing and the unconscious man's labored snores and the slow drip of blood from Noden's knuckles where the skin had split against Sam's teeth. Dr. Green appeared in the doorway, his old Navy Colt held in both hands, his knuckles white on the grip and his face pale but determined. "Well," he said after a long moment spent surveying the damage, the broken window, the cracked plaster, the knife embedded in his door frame, the man bleeding quietly onto his floor. "I suppose we're committed now." Noden pulled the knife free and tested its balance. It was poorly made, the tang weak where it met the handle and the blade showing pits from improper care, but the edge was sharp enough. "Pike will come back stronger next time. We cannot defend this place against all his men. We are 3 against a town." "Then what do you suggest?" Green asked, lowering the revolver with visible relief. Grace, still clutching the skillet in both hands, straightened her shoulders. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something had changed inside her during the fight. Some final barrier between fear and action had dissolved, leaving her with a clarity she had not felt since before she left St. Louis. "We don't defend," she said. "We attack first. We take away what gives him power." Both men looked at her. "I know where Pike keeps his records." She continued, speaking faster now, as the idea took shape in her mind, like clay taking form on a potter's wheel. "Every contract, every manufactured debt, every woman he's trafficked. There's a ledger, maybe more than one, that has all of it written down in his own hand. Names, dates, amounts paid to clerks and judges and lawmen to look the other way. If we can get those ledgers to the federal marshal in Medicine Bow, Pike won't be able to buy his way out. The evidence will be right there in black and white. He'll hang, and everyone who helped him will hang right beside him." Noden considered this, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Where does he keep them?" "In his office at the Silver Knife. There's a strong box steel, maybe 2 feet square, heavy enough that it takes 2 men to move it. I saw it once when Pike left his door open while he was meeting with someone from the territorial government in Cheyenne. Can you get to it?" Noden asked, and there was no doubt in his voice, no suggestion that she might not be capable. Simply a question that assumed she could do what needed to be done. Grace met his eyes and felt something settle into place inside her, something that might have been courage or might simply have been the understanding that she had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "I can. But I'll need help getting out afterward, because once Pike realizes what I've taken, he'll tear this town apart looking for me." Dr. Green set his revolver down on the examination table with a soft click that seemed very loud in the quiet room. He reached for his coat, his movements deliberate and final. "Then I suppose we'd better start planning," he said. "Because if we're going to do this, we only get one chance. And if we fail, Pike won't just kill us. He'll make it slow enough that everyone in coal dust learns what happens to people who cross him." They planned through the dark hours before dawn, huddled around Green's scarred kitchen table with a map of coal dust sketched in charcoal on butcher paper. Grace drew the layout of the Silver Knife from memory, the main saloon that faced the street, the narrow corridor that led past the kitchen where she had spent 4 months of her life. The back hallway with its doors to storerooms and private gambling rooms, where Pike entertained men he wanted to keep separate from the common miners, and at the very end, Pike's office. "The door has a lock," Grace said, tapping the paper with one finger. "But it's old, the kind you can pick with a bent nail if you know what you're doing. The real problem is the strong box. It's under his desk, bolted to the floor, so nobody can just carry it off, and I don't know where he keeps the key." "Where would he keep it?" Noden asked, his finger tracing the map, as though memorizing every detail. Grace closed her eyes, trying to remember. She had only glimpsed Pike's office twice, both times through a half-open door, when she was supposed to be scrubbing floors in the hallway, and not looking at anything except the boards under her brush. The desk had been massive, dark wood, scarred with years of use and abuse. Pike had been sitting behind it both times, his bulk filling the chair, his fingers shuffling through papers with the practiced ease of a man who handled money and power every day of his life. And around his neck, barely visible above his collar, catching the lamplight, her eyes snapped open. His watch chain. He wears a gold watch on a chain across his vest, but there's something else hanging on the chain too. Small, brass-colored. I thought it was a fob at first, just decoration, but it could be a key. It's the right size. Green nodded slowly, his pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling in lazy spirals. That makes sense. He'd want it close where he can always feel it. But that means you can't get the key unless he takes off his vest. Grace finished. Which he does when he's drinking late at night in his office. I've heard the other women talk about it. He drinks alone after the saloon closes, going through his account books and counting his money like a miser counting gold. Then that's when we go, Noden said. Tonight after midnight, when he's alone and drunk and not expecting trouble. And if he's not drunk enough, Green asked, ever the voice of caution. Then we improvise, Grace said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. I'm going back to the Silver Knife this afternoon. Pike will hear that I've come back and he'll think I'm scared. He'll think I've given up and realized I have nowhere else to go. And while he's thinking that, I'll be watching him, learning his routine, finding out exactly when he's most vulnerable. That's too dangerous. Green protested, his pipe forgotten in his hand. If Sam sees you, Sam's not going to do anything in front of customers or the other women, Grace said with more confidence than she felt. His pride won't let him. He'll wait until he can get me alone, which I won't let happen. And if Pike thinks I've come crawling back with my tail between my legs, he'll be more confident, more careless. Men like him always are when they think they've won. Noden looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face, as though reading something written there in a language only he could understand. You are braver than you know, he said quietly. Grace shook her head, feeling the weight of his words and not quite believing them. I'm terrified. But I'm more angry than I am scared, and anger is something I can use. Fear just makes you small and helpless. Anger makes you dangerous. She stood up, squaring her shoulders, and looked at both men in turn. I've been small and helpless for 4 months. It's time to be dangerous instead. Grace returned to the Silver Knife Saloon as the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of blood and copper and old gold. She walked through the front door as though the previous night's violence had never happened, her head down and her shoulders hunched in the posture of defeat that Pike would expect to see. She wore the same torn dress, had made no effort to hide the bruises on her wrists or the split in her lip. She looked exactly like what Pike would want her to be, a broken woman who had tried to escape and failed, and now understood that resistance was futile. Men looked up from their card games and their whiskey as she passed, their eyes following her with the dull curiosity of an animal's watching something that might be prey, or might be entertainment, or might be nothing at all. She kept her gaze on the floor and moved through the saloon toward the kitchen, where the heat and steam and chaos would hide her and keep her safe until she was ready to move. The other women in the kitchen glanced at her and said nothing. They understood. They all understood, because they had all been where Grace was now, trapped by manufactured debts and false contracts, and the simple, brutal fact that there was nowhere to run in a territory this empty and this hard. She had tried to escape and failed, just as they had all tried and failed at one time or another. Now she was back, and the only question was how badly Sam would hurt her before Pike decided she had learned her lesson. But Sam did not come. And Pike, when he emerged from his office to survey the evening crowd with the satisfied air of a king surveying his domain, merely glanced at her once and smiled his white-toothed smile. "Welcome back, Miss Holloway," he said, his voice carrying across the saloon loud enough for everyone to hear. "I trust you've reconsidered your rash decision of yesterday morning." "Yes, sir," Grace said, keeping her voice meek and her eyes down, playing the part he expected to see. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know what I was thinking. I was scared and foolish, and I realize now that I had nowhere else to go." "Well," Pike said, and his smile widened until it threatened to split his face in two. "We all make mistakes, Miss Holloway. The important thing is that you've come back to fulfill your obligations like an honest woman should. Now get to work. Those pots won't scrub themselves." "Yes, sir," Grace said. And she meant every word, even though she was lying through her teeth. She worked. She hauled coal from the cellar until her back screamed in protest. She scrubbed pots with lye soap that burned her already raw hands and left them red and weeping. She peeled vegetables and carried heavy trays and kept her head down and her ears open. And she watched. She watched Pike move through his kingdom, greeting miners and merchants by name, slapping backs and buying rounds of drinks, his laughter booming across the saloon like thunder. She watched him disappear into his office 3 times during the evening, each time emerging with papers that he handed to various men who nodded and left quickly through the back door. She watched the way he touched his watch chain, absently, his fingers running over the links, as though reassuring himself that the key was still there, that his insurance was still secure. And she watched bitter Sam, who sat in his usual corner, nursing a bottle of whiskey and cradling his broken hand, his eyes following her every movement, with the patient malevolence of a spider watching a fly struggle in its web. Sam did not approach her. He simply watched and waited, and Grace knew with cold certainty that he was waiting for his moment, for the time when he could get her alone and exact his revenge for the humiliation she had caused him. But Grace had no intention of giving him that chance. The saloon closed at midnight, the last customers stumbling out into the street or up the stairs to the rented rooms above. The women began the work of cleaning, wiping down tables sticky with spilled beer and whiskey, sweeping floors covered in sawdust and tobacco spit, and things Grace preferred not to identify, washing glasses in water so hot it raised blisters. Grace worked with them, moving slowly, waiting. One by one, the women finished their tasks and retreated to the cramped rooms upstairs where they slept 3 and 4 to a bed for warmth. Sam finally hauled himself to his feet and left through the back door, still cradling his hand, muttering curses under his breath. The saloon emptied until only Grace remained scrubbing the last of the pots in the kitchen, while her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to bruise. Through the thin wall that separated the kitchen from Pike's office, she could hear him moving about. The clink of bottle against glass, the creak of his chair as he settled his considerable weight into it, the rustle of papers being shuffled, the sound of a man who believed himself utterly safe in his own domain, surrounded by his own power, accountable to no one. She set down the pot she was scrubbing, dried her hands on her apron, and moved through the empty saloon like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Every board she had learned which boards creaked and which were safe, which shadows were deep enough to hide in and which would betray her. Pike's office door was closed, but not locked. She pressed her ear against the wood and listened. His breathing was slow and regular, punctuated by occasional snorts and the wet sounds of a man deep in his whiskey. She counted to 30, then 60, listening for the change in his breathing. That would tell her he had passed from drunk to sleeping. When it came, she tried the handle with infinite care. The door opened silently, well-oiled hinges, making no sound. Pike's office was lit by a single oil lamp turned low, casting thick shadows into the corners and making the room seem smaller and more oppressive than it probably was in daylight. Pike himself sat slumped in his chair behind the desk, his head tilted back against the leather, his mouth open, snoring like a saw biting through hardwood. His vest hung open unbuttoned, and the gold watch chain gleamed across his expansive belly like a promise. Grace slipped inside and closed the door behind her, with the kind of care usually reserved for handling nitroglycerin or sleeping babies. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run to get out while she still could, but she forced herself to move slowly and deliberately. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. She circled the desk, barely breathing, her eyes fixed on that watch chain. Pike's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. His breathing hitched once, and Grace froze, certain he would wake, certain he would open his eyes and see her standing there, and that would be the end of everything. But he merely snorted and shifted slightly in his chair, and resumed snoring. Grace reached out with trembling fingers and grasped the watch chain. The brass key was heavier than it looked, warm from Pike's body heat. She lifted it gently, carefully, ready to drop it and bolt at the first sign of him waking. The chain slid across his vest with a soft whisper of metal on fabric that sounded like thunder in the silent room. The key came free. Grace backed away from the desk with agonizing slowness, 1 step at a time. The key clutched in her fist so tightly, the metal bit into her palm. Pike snored on, oblivious. She turned her attention to the strongbox under the desk. It was exactly as she remembered, steel perhaps 2 feet square, bolted to the floor with heavy iron brackets. The lock was good quality, but the key fit perfectly. She turned it, and the lock opened with a soft click. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and prying eyes, lay 3 black ledgers and a thick sheaf of loose papers bound with string. Grace pulled them out with hands that shook so badly she nearly dropped them twice. She unwrapped the oilcloth just enough to glimpse the first ledger's contents, columns of names and dates and amounts, all written in Pike's neat, meticulous copperplate hand. Grace Holloway. Arrived April 12, 1867. Debts: travel fare $57, clothing advance $18, placement fee $35. Total owed $110. Current status: kitchen labor compliant. She turned pages with numb fingers, her stomach twisting into knots. Dozens of names. Hundreds, maybe, going back years. Some marked with notes about where the women had been sent or what had become of them. Relocated to Denver. Married to J. Smith, rancher. Transferred to Chicago operation. Others marked only with that single terrible word, written in red ink, lost. Near the back of the first ledger, wedged tight against the spine, where it might easily be missed by a casual observer, she found a folded paper. She pulled it out and unfolded it with infinite care. It was a telegram copy, the ink faded to violet with age, dated 3 months earlier. To H. Marshall, telegraph clerk, Medicine Bow Station. Stop. Alter territorial records per attached names. Stop. Mark status: married/relocated. Stop. Strike all missing persons notices. Stop. Destroy original inquiries. Stop. Payment as previously agreed. Stop. M. Pike below. The message was a list of 12 names, written in the same careful hand. Grace recognized 2 of them, immediately women who had worked in the Silver Knife kitchen and had vanished overnight last summer. And at the bottom of the list, written in letters that seemed to burn themselves into her vision, Louisa Bauer. Grace's breath caught in her throat like a hook catching flesh. She knew that name. Hans and Maud Bauer farmed a small holding on the eastern edge of town, 40 acres of hardscrabble land, that they worked from dawn until dark, with their 3 children helping. They had come to the Silver Knife once 6 months ago, speaking in halting English and broken by grief, asking if anyone had seen Hans's younger sister Louisa. She had answered a marriage advertisement, they said. She had been so excited, had saved money for 2 years to pay for the journey west. She had written them 1 letter after arriving, saying she had reached coal dust safely and would write again soon. Then silence. Nothing for months. Pike had met them at the door, all sympathy and concern, and told them that Louisa had indeed arrived, but had married a rancher up north near the Montana border and was very happy in her new life. He had even shown them a letter, though Grace had been too far away to see if the handwriting looked genuine or forged. He had lied. Louisa Bauer had never left Coal Dust. She was marked lost in Pike's ledger, which meant Grace did not let herself finish that thought. She wrapped the ledgers and telegram back in the oilcloth, her hands moving on pure instinct, now her mind frozen by the weight of what she had discovered. She tucked the bundle under her arm, relocked the strongbox, and stood up. Behind her, Pike's snoring stopped. The silence was absolute and terrifying. Grace turned her head slowly, so slowly it felt like moving through honey, and saw Pike's eyes flutter open. For one frozen instant, they stared at each other across the dim office. Grace standing by the open strongbox with the ledgers clutched to her chest. Pike slumped in his chair with confusion, giving way to comprehension, giving way to rage. "You little..." Pike lunged up from his chair with surprising speed for a man his size and level of intoxication. Grace bolted. She spun toward the door, but Pike was faster than she had any right to expect. His hand closed on her shoulder like a bear trap, spinning her around with enough force to make her teeth clack together. The ledgers started to slip from her grip. She swung them up instinctively, drove the bundle into Pike's face with all the strength she could muster. The corner caught him across the cheek, opening a gash that immediately began to bleed. Pike roared and backhanded her. The blow caught her across the temple and sent her sprawling stars exploding across her vision. The ledgers flew from her hands and skidded across the floor. Pike lunged after them, his face twisted with rage and something else, fear perhaps, or the sudden understanding that everything he had built was about to collapse. Grace kicked out wildly, her foot connecting with Pike's knee. He went down with a bellow of pain and fury, his considerable weight hitting the floor hard enough to shake the building. The door burst open. Nodin came through like a summer storm, given human form, Dr. Green right behind him, with his old Navy Colt drawn and shaking in his hands. Nodin took in the situation in a single glance. Grace on the floor, bleeding from her temple, Pike lunging for the ledgers, the open strong box, and moved with the kind of decisive speed that comes from a lifetime of hunting and being hunted. He caught Pike's outstretched arm and wrenched it back with brutal efficiency, forcing the older man away from the ledgers and slamming him face first into the desk. The desk shifted, papers and bottles sliding to the floor in a cascade of breaking glass and fluttering documents. Pike struggled, surprisingly strong for his age and bulk. But Nodin had leverage and youth and a rage that had been building for months as he watched his people sicken and die. "Get the ledgers!" Nodin shouted, his voice tight with strain, as Pike bucked and fought beneath him. Grace scrambled across the floor, her head ringing from Pike's blow, and scooped up the fallen bundle. Dr. Green grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet, steadying her when her knees tried to buckle. Behind them, Pike was screaming for his men, his voice carrying through the thin walls and into the building above. Boots pounded on floorboards as men woke and reached for weapons. The silver knife was coming alive around them like a kicked ant nest. They ran. Out through Pike's office, through the dark saloon where chairs and tables loomed like obstacles in a nightmare, through the back door and into the alley beyond. Behind them, the silver knife erupted with shouts and curses and the sound of men pouring down the stairs in pursuit. They made it back to Dr. Green's office through a maze of back alleys and empty lots that Grace had never known existed, running through the darkness with their lungs burning and their hearts hammering like trapped birds beating against cage bars. Behind them, coal dust was waking up, lanterns appearing in windows, voices calling out questions, and the sound of organized pursuit growing louder and more focused. Inside Green's office, they barred the door and extinguished the lamps standing in the darkness while they caught their breath and listened to the town searching for them. Grace clutched the ledgers to her chest, her temple throbbing where Pike had hit her, and tried to make sense of what they had just done. "We have it," she gasped when she could finally speak. "We actually have it." "We have evidence," Dr. Green corrected, his voice hoarse. "But evidence won't matter a lick if we can't get it to someone who cares and has the authority to act on it. Medicine Bow is 3 days hard riding east, assuming the weather holds and we don't run into trouble. Pike will have men on every road out of town by dawn. Then we don't take the roads," Noden said. He moved to the window and peered out through a gap in the curtain, his face barely visible in the darkness. "We go north into the hills. Pike's men will expect us to run for Medicine Bow or south toward Cheyenne. They won't expect us to go toward my people's camp." "Your people?" Grace repeated, her mind still foggy from the blow to her head. "The river. The river is why I came here in the first place." Noden said, his voice carrying a weight of grief and anger that Grace was only beginning to understand. "Pike's mine is poisoning the Snake River with runoff from his operation. The water runs gray and bitter. The fish have died. The game has left. My people have been dying for 6 months, children with fevers and belly cramps, elders with sores that will not heal. If we can show the tribal elders what is in those ledgers, if we can prove Pike's other crimes, then maybe the Indian agent will finally listen when we tell him about the poisoned water. And if the agent won't listen, then we take the ledgers to Medicine Bow ourselves and make the federal marshal listen whether he wants to or not." Dr. Green nodded slowly, already moving toward his surgery, where he kept his medical bag and supplies. "There's an old freight trail that runs north through the hills. It's rough and narrow, but horses can manage it if you're careful. Pike uses it to move ore and supplies to an abandoned shaft. He's been working up there a played-out operation from the 50s that he's trying to reopen on the cheap. If we can reach that trail before dawn—" A rifle bullet shattered the window, spraying them all with broken glass. They threw themselves to the floor as more shots followed, punching through the thin walls and burying themselves in the furniture and the walls beyond. "They've found us," Green said unnecessarily, his face pressed against the floorboards. "Out the back," Noden ordered, already crawling toward the rear of the building. "Move, now." They grabbed what they could in the darkness, the ledgers Green's medical bag, the rifles and ammunition Green kept hidden in his cellar, against a day he had hoped would never come. They fled out the back door and into the stable behind the office, where 3 horses waited in the darkness. Green's elderly gelding, a young mare he had accepted as payment from a patient who had no money, and the horse Noden had ridden into town 3 days earlier. They saddled them by feel and instinct, working with the frantic efficiency of people who know that every second counts, and that hesitation means death. They were leading the horses out of the stable when the first flames appeared. Pike's men had set fire to Dr. Green's office. The dry wood caught quickly, flames climbing the walls and leaping from board to board, spreading with terrifying speed. Within moments, the entire building was ablaze, lighting up the night like a torch and drawing people from their homes to stand and watch and wonder what had happened. "We have to go," Noden said, his face grim in the firelight. "Now, before they surround us." They mounted and rode north out of coal dust and into the darkness beyond, while behind them Green's office collapsed inward with a roar of flame and falling timber, and Mortimer Pike stood in the street screaming orders at his men and promising death to anyone who helped the fugitives escape. They rode hard through what remained of the night, following trails that were barely more than suggestions scratched into the hillsides by deer and elk. Noden led his instincts and memory guiding them, even when the moon disappeared behind clouds, and the darkness became so absolute that Grace could barely see her horse's ears in front of her. She rode with the ledgers strapped to her saddle, and her hands aching from gripping the reins, her head throbbing from Pike's blow, and her body protesting every jarring step the horse took. Dr. Green brought up the rear, his medical bag bouncing against his back. his breath coming in labored gasps that spoke of a man pushed beyond his usual limits. But he kept up, driven by stubbornness or desperation, or perhaps simple momentum. Once you started running, stopping meant dying. As dawn broke gray and cold across the eastern hills, they crested a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley carved by time and water and the patient work of erosion. Below them, nestled against the northern slope, like a tumor growing on healthy flesh, Grace could see the remains of an old mining operation. Timber structures half collapsed with age and abandonment, or carts rusted to the color of dried blood and the black mouth of a mine shaft, gaping like a wound that had never healed. And beyond that, barely visible in the morning mist that clung to the low places, a thin plume of gray smoke rose from somewhere deeper in the complex. The north shaft, Dr. Green said, his voice hoarse from breathing cold air and coal smoke. Pike reopened it last year. Uses it to move things he doesn't want people in coal dust to see or know about. Things like women, Grace said quietly, and it was not a question. Green nodded, his face grim. There have been rumors for months. Women who arrive on the stagecoach with marriage contracts and then disappear before anyone can get to know them. Pike tells people they changed their minds and left on the next stage heading east, but no one ever sees them leave. They just vanish. Nodin studied the valley below with the focused intensity of a hunter assessing terrain and obstacles and lines of sight. If Louisa Bauer is still alive, she would be held there. If she's alive. Grace echoed, remembering the telegram and the names marked lost in Pike's ledger. She thought of Hans and Maud Bauer and their 3 children, thought of the grief that would destroy them if they learned their sister was dead, and felt anger kindle in her chest like a fire being laid in a cold hearth. We have to know. We have to try. We came this far, Nodin said. We stole Pike's ledgers and burned his leverage and made ourselves his enemies. To turn back now would make all of that meaningless. We go down. We see who is being held there. We free them if we can. And then we ride for my people's camp with the evidence we've gathered. And we let the truth speak for itself. They descended into the valley as the sun climbed higher, painting the hills in shades of gold and amber and throwing long shadows across the scrubland. The trail wound between boulders the size of houses and stands of stunted pine that clung to life in soil too poor to support anything larger. Loose shale crumbled under the horses' hooves, sliding away in small avalanches that sounded impossibly loud in the morning quiet and left trails of disturbed earth that anyone with eyes could follow. Nodin raised his hand, suddenly signaling a halt. He had gone very still in the way that predators go still when they sense danger. His head tilted slightly, as though listening to something Grace could not hear. Then she heard it too. The distant sound of horses. Many horses moving fast, the rhythm of hooves on hard ground, carrying across the valley like distant thunder. They followed us, Dr. Green said, his face going pale beneath the coal dust and grime. No, Nodin said, and there was something in his voice that made Grace's blood run cold. They didn't follow us. They got ahead of us. Pike knew where we would go. He knew we couldn't risk the roads, so we'd come through the hills, and he sent riders during the night to circle around and cut us off. Even as he spoke, the first rifle shots cracked out from the ridgeline above and to the east of them. Bullets whined through the air with that distinctive high-pitched sound that meant they were passing very close, striking sparks off stone, kicking up geysers of dirt and pulverized rock. Dr. Green's horse screamed a high, terrible sound and went down hard, throwing the doctor from the saddle. He hit the ground and rolled, coming up on his hands and knees, with blood streaming from a gash on his scalp. Grace's mare reared, nearly unseating her terror and confusion, making the animal unmanageable. Nodin grabbed her reins with one hand and hauled both horses behind a massive boulder that offered some cover from the gunfire above. Then he went back for Dr. Green, running in a crouch, making himself as small a target as possible. Another volley of shots tore through the space where he had been standing a moment before, so close that Grace could hear the bullets cutting through the air with sounds like fabric tearing. Nodin grabbed Dr. Green under the arms and dragged him behind the boulder, just as another shot struck the ground where the doctor had been lying, sending up a spray of dirt and small stones. They were pinned in a killing box, with no way forward and no way back, caught between the steep walls of the ravine and the riflemen above. Grace could see them now, dark shapes moving along the ridgeline, 8, maybe 10 men, all of them armed, all of them between the fugitives and any hope of escape. Pike had planned this ambush with care and patience, knowing that desperation would drive them north and that terrain would funnel them into this exact spot. "We're going to die here," Dr. Green said. He was not panicking or even particularly afraid, merely stating what seemed to him to be an obvious fact. Blood ran down his face from the scalp wound, but his hands were steady as he checked his revolver and found it had only 3 rounds remaining. "Not yet," Nodin said, checking his own rifle. He had perhaps 10 shots left, maybe fewer. Against 10 riflemen in good positions with all the ammunition they needed and all the time in the world, it was not enough. Not nearly enough. But then another rifle shot rang out, and one of Pike's men on the ridge jerked backward and fell tumbling down the slope in a spray of loose rock and dust and flailing limbs. Another shot from a completely different direction. Another man down. The remaining gunmen scattered, suddenly confused and afraid, unsure which direction the threat was coming from. They had been the hunters a moment ago. Now they were the hunted, and the psychological impact of that reversal was immediate and profound. "Someone's shooting at them," Grace said, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. "Not someone," Nodin said. And there was something in his voice that might have been surprise, or might have been grim satisfaction, or might have been both. "Fitzgerald." Chotro, and indeed, on a higher ridge opposite Pike's men, and commanding the field with brutal efficiency, Grace could now see a lone figure with a rifle methodically picking off Pike's shooters one by one with the kind of cold precision that spoke of years of practice and a complete absence of hesitation or doubt. The rifle fired. A man fell. The rifle fired again. Another man went down. It was not dramatic or heroic. It was simply execution carried out at long range with professional competence. "Why would he help us?" Dr. Green asked, pressing a hand to his bleeding scalp. "Because his name is in those ledgers too," Grace said, understanding flooding through her like cold water poured down her back. "He's helped Pike recover fugitive women over the years. If Pike hangs for trafficking, Fitzgerald hangs with him as an accomplice. But if Pike dies, and Fitzgerald is the man who helped bring him down, if Fitzgerald can claim he didn't know what Pike was really doing and turned witness when he found out the truth, he walks away clean." Nodin finished. There was approval in his voice, the kind of respect one predator gives to another who has made a clever play. "He is a survivor. Like us." They moved fast, taking advantage of the confusion Fitzgerald had created. Staying low and using every scrap of cover available, they sprinted toward the old mine buildings below. Bullets chased them, chewing up the ground around their feet, whining off rocks close enough that Grace could feel the displaced air as they passed. But Fitzgerald's covering fire kept Pike's men pinned down long enough for the fugitives to reach the squat timber structure that housed the old hoist mechanism. They hit the door at a dead run. 3 desperate people moving on pure adrenaline and the will to survive. The door gave way under their combined weight, splintering inward, and they tumbled through into darkness and relative safety. Grace threw the bar across the door just as something heavy struck it from the outside, an axe maybe, or a rifle butt wielded with fury and frustration. For the moment, they were safe, but only for the moment. Inside the hoist house, The air was thick with the smell of machine oil, gone rancid and old timber rotting from the inside out. And something else underneath it, all the sharp tang of fear and unwashed bodies and human suffering. Lanterns hung from the rafters on rusty chains, swaying gently in the draft from the broken windows and casting shadows that danced and twisted like living things. And against the far wall, chained to iron rings set into the floor, with the kind of casual cruelty that spoke of long practice, were 3 women. Grace saw them and felt something inside her chest crack open, something that had been holding her together by force of will alone. They were skeletal, their dresses torn and filthy beyond any hope of cleaning, their hair matted into tangles that would probably have to be cut away. Their eyes were too large in their hollow faces, and when they saw Grace and the others, they shrank back as though expecting more violence, more cruelty, more of the endless nightmare that had become their existence. One of them was Louisa Bauer. Grace recognized her from the daguerreotype Hans had shown her 6 months ago, when the Bauers had come to the Silver Knife, asking about their missing sister, a young woman with gentle eyes and a shy smile. Someone who had believed in the promises printed in newspaper advertisements and had paid for that belief with months of suffering Grace could barely imagine. Those eyes were not gentle now. They were the eyes of something that had been broken and poorly mended, that had learned not to hope because hope only made the disappointment worse when it was inevitably crushed. "We're here to help," Grace said, dropping to her knees beside them. Her voice came out rough and unsteady, but she forced herself to keep talking, to keep making human sounds that were not screams or curses or violence. "We're getting you out of here. I promise. We're going to get you out." The women said nothing. They simply stared at her with those huge, haunted eyes, as though they had heard promises before, and learned through bitter experience that promises meant nothing. Outside, the sound of men shouting, the thud of axes against the door, the sharp crack of rifle fire as Pike's men and Fitzgerald continued their lethal game of cat and mouse on the ridges above. "Noden, Dr. Green called from the window, where he and Noden were frantically stacking ore carts and empty barrels to form a makeshift barricade. "They're bringing up powder kegs. They mean to blow the door and bury us all." Grace's hands shook as she searched through the keys she had taken from Pike's office, Key's desk. Key's the key to the strongbox. Wrong keys, all wrong. These women were not locked away with office supplies. They were chained like animals, and the keys to their bondage would be kept separate, probably on the person of whoever Pike had left to guard them. A bullet punched through the wall, sending splinters flying. One caught Grace across the cheek, drawing a line of fire and blood. She barely felt it. "There." Louisa Bauer said, her voice a hoarse whisper, unused to speaking, half afraid that speaking would bring punishment. She pointed with one skeletal hand toward a nail driven into one of the support posts. "Guard keeps them there. He comes twice a day, morning and evening. Brings water. Brings bread." Grace looked where she was pointing and saw another ring of keys hanging from the nail. These ones crude and heavy, made for locks that did not need to be subtle or sophisticated, because the people they imprisoned had no hope of escape anyway. She grabbed them and tried the first one in the nearest lock. It fit. The lock opened with a click that sounded like salvation given physical form. "Can you walk?" Grace asked, helping Louisa to her feet. The young woman was so light, Grace could have carried her like a child, all bone and no flesh, her wrists bearing the marks of months in chains. "I can run," Louisa said, and there was steel in her voice despite everything she had endured. "If it means getting out of here, I can run forever." Grace freed the other 2 women quickly. One was young, barely 16, if she was that with eyes that had seen things no child should ever have to witness. The other was older, perhaps 30, with scars on her wrists that spoke of previous attempts to escape that had been punished with deliberate and methodical cruelty. "There's another way out," the older woman said. Her voice was raw but steady, the voice of someone who had kept her sanity by observing and planning and waiting for an opportunity that she had almost stopped believing would ever come. "The old mine shaft. It goes under the ridge and comes out on the far side. They kept it open in case of cave-ins back when this place was still operating. The timbers are old and half-rotted, but it's still passable if you're careful." Noden left the window and joined them, his face grim. "Can you lead us through it?" "I can try. I've only been down there once when they first brought me here. But I remember the way. I made myself remember because I thought, someday." She trailed off, then shook her head and straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I can lead you." The doors shuddered under a massive blow that shook dust from the rafters and made the whole structure groan like a ship in a storm. Wood cracked. Hinges screamed. Pike's men were through the outer barrier and working on the inner door now, and it would not hold much longer. "Go," Noden said to Grace, his rifle ready. His expression set in the kind of determination that comes when a man has decided he is willing to die, if that's what it takes to see a job finished. "Lead them. I'll buy you as much time as I can." "Not without you," Grace said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. They had come too far together, survived too much together for her to leave him now, to die alone holding a door against impossible odds. Their eyes met across the dim and smoky space. Something passed between them in that look, not words, but understanding deeper than words could ever reach. A recognition that they had tied their fates together the moment he had pulled her from in front of that wagon, that neither of them was willing to walk away from the other. Now even if walking away meant living and staying meant dying. "Together then," Noden said, and he said it like a vow. They found the shaft entrance, hidden behind a false wall at the back of the hoist house, old boards nailed over the opening decades ago, and now half-rotted and easy to tear away. It opened into darkness so absolute that looking into it was like looking into the void before creation. The timber supports at the entrance were ancient and waterlogged green with moss and white with fungus, groaning under the weight of the mountain above them. Dr. Green went first, carrying one of the lanterns, helping the 3 freed women over the rough ground, where the floor was uneven and treacherous, with loose stone and hidden drops. Grace followed, clutching the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and strapped to her body like armor that might somehow protect her against bullets or collapsing rock or the simple, overwhelming terror of being buried alive. Noden came last, his rifle ready, listening to the sounds of Pike's men breaking through the final barrier and pouring into the hoist house behind them. The shaft descended steeply into the earth, and the air growing colder and damper, with every step they took away from the surface and safety. Water dripped from the ceiling in a constant pattering rain, pooling in the low spots and soaking through their boots and clothes until they were all shivering. The timber supports groaned and creaked, settling under the weight of thousands of tons of rock, and occasionally small stones would fall from the ceiling with sharp cracks that made everyone flinch and duck and wonder if this was the moment when the whole thing would come down on their heads. And from behind them, echoing down the shaft, with the distorted acoustics that made it impossible to tell how far away they were, came the sound of men's voices and the pounding of boots on stone, and the certain knowledge that Pike's men were following them into the dark. The shaft narrowed. What had been a passage wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast became a squeeze barely wider than a man's chest, the rock pressing in on all sides, cold and slick with moisture and mineral deposits that had built up over decades of water, seeping through cracks in the stone. The lantern light seemed to die within arm's reach, swallowed by an absolute darkness that felt alive and hungry. Grace stopped. She could not help it. The weight of the mountain above her, the press of stone on either side, the darkness ahead, and behind, the certain knowledge that she was trapped deep under the earth, in a passage that might collapse at any moment and bury her alive. It all became too much. Her chest tightened. She could not breathe, could not move, could not think beyond the overwhelming panic that flooded through her like ice water in her veins. "Grace." Noden's voice came from directly behind her in the darkness, low and steady and utterly calm. "Breathe with me." He pressed close, so close in the narrow space that there was no room for anything between them, his chest against her back, his warmth cutting through the cold and the fear. He took her hand and placed it flat against his ribs just below his heart, and she could feel it beating there, steady and strong, as a drum calling warriors to battle. "Feel my breath." He set his lips so close to her ear that she could feel the warmth of his words. "Slow and steady. In for 4 heartbeats, out for 4 heartbeats. Count with me. In, 1, 2, 3, 4. Out, 1, 2, 3, 4. She felt his heart beating against her palm, felt his chest rise and fall in that steady rhythm, and gradually, painfully, slowly, she managed to match her breathing to his. The panic receded just enough to let her think, just enough to let her remember that she had survived 4 months in Pike's kitchen, and a midnight robbery, and a chase through the hills, and being shot at by men who wanted her dead. She could survive this too. She would survive this because Noden was with her, and together they were stronger than either of them was alone. "Better?" he asked after a long moment, his voice a quiet rumble she felt more than heard. "Better," she whispered, and was surprised to find that it was true. "The others need you to be strong," Noden said. "If you stop here, they stop. If you panic, they panic. So we keep moving. We move together, and we get through this together, and we come out the other side alive." "Yes, yes," Grace said, and she pushed forward into the squeeze. The stone scraped her shoulders, caught on her dress, and tore the fabric pressed against her chest and back until she thought her ribs would crack under the pressure. She had to turn sideways, had to edge through inch by painful inch, her breathing shallow, because there was no room in her lungs for deep breaths. Behind her, Noden moved with her, his presence a constant reminder that she was not alone in the dark, that if she fell, he would catch her, that if she broke, he would hold the pieces together until she could mend. They squeezed through the narrowest part and into a slightly wider chamber, and Grace allowed herself one shuddering breath of relief. Behind them, she could hear Pike's men struggling through the same squeeze, cursing and fighting the stone, their voices echoing strangely in the confined space. And then, from somewhere above and ahead, a deep groaning sound. The timbers were giving way, stressed beyond their capacity by the passage of too many people, and the weight of the mountain and the simple accumulated rot of decades. "Move!" Dr. Green shouted from ahead, his voice tight with urgency. "Run, the whole thing's coming down." They ran stumbling through the darkness, their lungs burning from the thin air and the exertion and the coal dust that seemed to coat everything down here. Behind them, the groaning grew louder, became a sustained rumbling like distant thunder rolling closer. A timber cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. Rocks fell in a trickle, then a stream, then a cascade. One of the women, the youngest, barely 16, stumbled and went down hard. Grace grabbed her arm and hauled her upright with strength she did not know she possessed, half carrying the girl as they ran deeper into the mine. Ahead, Grace could see daylight, not sunlight exactly, but a pale gray light that meant an opening to the surface, an escape from this nightmare of collapsing stone and suffocating darkness. "Go!" Grace shoved the girl toward the opening. Louisa and the older woman scrambled through their skeletal forms, barely visible in the gray light. Dr. Green followed then Grace, and finally Nodin, diving through the narrow crack just as behind them the shaft collapsed. The sound was beyond deafening. It was a physical force that picked them up and threw them forward, that filled the air with dust so thick it blotted out the weak daylight that went on and on, until Grace thought it would never stop and they would all die anyway, just from the sheer weight of sound pressing down on them. But eventually, it did stop. The rumbling faded to echoes then, to silence. When Grace could finally see again through the settling dust, when she could finally breathe without choking, she found herself lying on a rocky ledge high above a ravine, blinking in the sudden brightness and trying to convince herself that she was actually alive. They had emerged onto a narrow shelf carved into the hillside by erosion and time, hidden from casual observation by an outcrop of stone. Below them, the hillside had collapsed inward, taking the hoist house and everything around it down into a crater of shattered rock and splintered timber. Smoke and dust rose from the crater like the exhalation of some enormous dying beast, obscuring details, but not hiding the scale of the destruction. And from that rubble, nothing moved. No one called for help. The silence was absolute and final. Mortimer Pike had followed them into the mine, driven by greed and rage and the absolute refusal to accept that he could lose, that his empire could crumble, that the women and evidence he had fought so hard to reclaim could escape his grasp. He had ordered his men forward, even when the timbers groaned and the rocks shifted, even when caution and common sense screamed at them to turn back. He had been in the shaft when it collapsed, and now he was buried under tons of rock and timber and the mountain he had poisoned in his relentless pursuit of wealth. Justice, Grace thought with a clarity that surprised her, did not always come from judges and courtrooms and carefully written laws. Sometimes justice came from the earth itself, from the simple fact that mountains do not forgive and stone does not forget. And eventually, every man who takes more than his share will find that he has taken too much. They made their way down from the ledge, slowly helping each other over the rough ground, moving like survivors of a war, stumbling toward some distant place that might offer rest and safety. They were halfway down when they saw Fitzgerald riding up from the south, leading 2 pack horses loaded with supplies. He pulled up when he saw them, his gray eyes taking in their condition, the blood and the coal dust and the exhaustion written on every face. He dismounted and walked toward them, moving with the easy confidence of a man who had made his choice and intended to live with the consequences. "Pike?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Buried," Nodin said. "The mine collapsed. He's under it along with most of his men." Fitzgerald nodded as though this was what he had expected. "I reckon those ledgers need to get to Medicine Bow. Federal Marshal needs to see them before someone tries to make this all go away." "They will." Grace said, her hand moving instinctively to touch the oilcloth bundle strapped to her side. "Will you come with us? You'll need to give testimony about what you saw, what you know." Fitzgerald shook his head. "I'll give testimony when the marshal comes calling. You tell him Fitzgerald is willing to cooperate, that I'll answer questions truthfully about what Pike was doing and who helped him do it. But I've got business elsewhere first. Loose ends to tie up." He looked at Nodin. "Your people's camp. How far north following the river?" 2 days' ride for a man who knows the trails," Nodin said. "Good. I'll make sure word reaches the Indian agent in Cheyenne that Pike's mine operation was what poisoned the Snake River. Should be enough to get the government boys interested in investigating, especially once they see those ledgers and realize Pike was paying bribes to territorial officials." He tipped his hat to them, a gesture that seemed almost formal. Doc, good luck to all of you. I hope you make it count." He mounted his horse and rode away south, and they never saw him again. But years later, Grace would hear stories of a man called the Witness, who testified in federal corruption trials across the Western Territories, a man who could not be bought or threatened or intimidated, who appeared when prosecutors needed him and disappeared afterward like smoke in wind. She would smile when she heard those stories and say nothing, but she would know. They reached coal dust as the sun was setting 3 days later, a ragged procession of survivors moving down the main street, while townspeople emerged from buildings to stare in silence. Dr. Green's burned office had been rebuilt, the new timber still fresh and yellow. The silver knife stood empty and dark, its windows shattered, its door hanging open on broken hinges like the mouth of a corpse. On the main street, people gathered in uncertain clusters, talking in low voices about Pike's disappearance, and the rumored collapse at the North Shaft, and the questions federal marshals had been asking about missing women and forged contracts. When the survivors appeared, Grace and Noden walking side by side, Dr. Green and the 3 freed women following Hans and Maud Bauer, riding up from the east with their children, the crowd fell silent. Dr. Green climbed onto the same wooden crate he had stood on many times before to call town meetings. He was filthy and exhausted and looked every one of his 50-plus years, but his voice when he spoke was steady and carried across the crowd with perfect clarity. "Mortimer Pike is dead," he announced, and a ripple ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Buried under his own mine when his greed and his crimes brought the mountain down on him. But before he died, he left something behind that you all need to see. He held up the black ledgers wrapped in oilcloth that was stained with blood and coal dust and the honest sweat of people fighting for their lives. These are Pike's records. Every woman he trafficked under false contracts. Every debt he manufactured to keep them trapped. Every bribe he paid to clerks and judges and lawmen to keep them looking the other way. And all the names of everyone who helped him build his empire of suffering. He opened the first ledger and began to read. Grace Holloway, Anna Crenshaw, Margaret Voss, Sarah Mackenzie, Louisa Bauer. With each name, someone in the crowd gasped or cried out or stepped forward with terrible recognition dawning in their eyes, with the understanding that this could have been their daughter, their sister, their wife, if circumstances had been slightly different. When he finished reading the names marked, lost Hans Bauer stepped forward with Louisa at his side. She was skeletal and haunted but alive, and that was what mattered. Hans spoke in halting English, his voice shaking, but his words clear. "This is my sister. Pike told us she married a rancher and was happy. He showed us a letter, all lies. She was chained in his mind like an animal. How many of you have daughters who answered advertisements? How many of you believed Pike when he said they had moved on to better lives? How many of you looked the other way when women disappeared because it was easier than asking questions?" The crowd erupted not with violence, but with a wave of grief and rage that had been building for years under the surface of daily life in coal dust. Pike's remaining men, those who had not followed him into the mine and died in the collapse, were seized by the same townspeople who had once drunk with them, bought them rounds, and pretended not to see the blood on their hands. The town jail overflowed with prisoners awaiting the federal marshal's arrival, and Noden, who had stood silent through all of this with the patience of stone, walked to the cottonwood tree by the town well. The vigilante rope still hung from its lowest branch, swaying in the evening breeze, a reminder of threatened violence that had never quite materialized. He drew his knife, the same knife that had been embedded in Dr. Green's door frame 3 nights ago, and cut the rope down with one clean stroke. He let it fall in the dust and looked across the crowd until he found Grace's eyes. Something passed between them in that look, not words, but understanding. They had done what they set out to do. Justice had been served, though not in the way anyone might have expected or planned. The work was not finished, would perhaps never be truly finished. But they had struck a blow against the kind of casual evil that flourishes when good people look away. The federal marshal arrived from Medicine Bow a week later with a full complement of deputies and warrants issued by the territorial governor himself. He was a hard man with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of human cruelty and were no longer surprised by any of it. He examined the ledgers for 3 days, cross-referencing names and dates, sending telegrams to Washington and Cheyenne and St. Louis, building a case that would eventually reach all the way to the territorial legislature and result in reforms that changed how labor contracts were enforced throughout Wyoming Territory. Pike's telegraph clerk in Medicine Bow was arrested. 2 territorial judges were arrested. A dozen other men whose names appeared in the ledgers, mine foremen, freight agents, saloon owners, were arrested and charged with various crimes ranging from fraud to conspiracy to white slavery and the abduction of women. The trials would take months, would fill the newspapers, and horrify readers across the nation, would eventually lead to new federal laws and oversight that would make it harder, though not impossible, for men like Pike to operate with impunity. In the immediate aftermath, coal dust began the slow work of healing. The mine was shut down for 6 months while engineers determined how to extract coal without poisoning the Snake River. The solution involved new drainage channels and settling ponds, and federal inspectors who could not be bribed or threatened. When the mine reopened, it was under new management with safety protocols and fair wages paid in actual currency instead of company scrip. The practice of peonage and debt servitude was outlawed by territorial decree with criminal penalties for violation that made even the greediest operators think twice. Within 2 months, the Snake River began to run clear again. Fish returned to waters that had been dead for over a year. Game came back to drink at the banks. And in the Lakota camps 30 miles north, children who had been sick for months with fevers and sores and belly cramps began to recover. The eldest grandmother in the camp declared that the water spirits had forgiven them for some unknown transgression. But the younger people, especially those who had heard Nodin's reports from coal dust, knew the truth. The water was clean again because people had fought to make it clean, had risked everything to expose the poison and stop it at its source. Nodin rode between coal dust and the camps regularly, now his role evolving from warrior to diplomat to translator to guide. He carried messages between the territorial government and the tribal council's escorted supply wagons that brought food and medicine promised by treaty, but rarely delivered, served as witness when the Indian agent finally deigned to visit the camps and see with his own eyes the damage that had been done. The work was slow and frustrating. Decades of betrayal and broken promises could not be mended in a season. But it was work that mattered, work that made a difference, even if the difference was small and hard-won. Hans and Maud Bauer kept their land. They built a small addition onto their farmhouse so that Louisa could have her own room while she healed. It took time, months, before she could sleep through the night, without waking up screaming, a full year before she could look at a stranger, without flinching, longer still before she could speak about what had been done to her, without her voice breaking. But gradually, with the patient love of her family surrounding her like armor, Louisa Bauer came back to herself. She would never be the same person who had left Germany full of hope and dreams of a new life in America. That person had died in Pike's mine. But the person who emerged from the ashes was stronger, harder, and absolutely unwilling to let anyone else suffer what she had suffered if there was anything she could do to prevent it. The other 2 freed women found their own paths forward. One married a shopkeeper in coal dust, a widower with 2 children who needed a mother, and a woman who needed proof that not all men were monsters. The other moved on to Denver, where she used what little money she had managed to save to open a boarding house for women traveling alone, a place with clean rooms and fair prices and doors that locked from the inside. Both of them would later testify before territorial investigators, their words helping to convict men who had thought themselves untouchable, their courage helping to ensure that the reforms that followed Pike's death would have teeth. Dr. Albert Green rebuilt his practice in the new office the town had constructed for him. It was larger than the old one, with a proper surgery and examination rooms, and a small ward for patients who needed overnight care. He never charged the Lakota who came to him for treatment, and he never turned away a patient who could not pay regardless of their race or circumstances. When he died of a heart attack 15 years later, while delivering a baby in a sod house 20 miles from town, both Lakota and white settlers attended his funeral. They buried him in ground that overlooked the Snake River, and for years afterward, travelers on the northern road would see wildflowers growing on his grave, left there by people whose lives he had touched, whose suffering he had eased, whose existence he had validated simply by treating them as human beings worthy of care and dignity. Grace Holloway and Louisa Bauer opened their cookhouse on the eastern edge of coal dust in early autumn, when the aspen trees turned gold on the hillsides and the air carried the first sharp promise of winter. It was a simple building frame construction, with clean windows and a sturdy roof that did not leak, but it was theirs. They served honest food at fair prices, venison stew and roasted chicken and fresh bread and apple pie on Sundays. They paid the women they hired honest wages with written contracts that spelled out exactly what was owed and what was expected. And they provided rooms above the kitchen, with doors that locked from the inside and windows that opened onto the street, so that anyone passing by could hear if someone screamed for help. Grace kept a ledger on the shelf behind the counter, and she recorded every transaction with the same meticulous care that Pike had used in his ledgers of bondage. But where Pike's ledgers had recorded debts that grew like cancer, Grace's ledger recorded honest work and honest pay debts incurred, and debts-satisfied accounts balanced to the penny. Her handwriting no longer shook when she wrote the numbers. The letter from the territorial government arrived on a cold October morning, carried by a postal rider who seemed surprised to find a woman not just working in a business, but actually owning it. Grace signed for the letter with steady hands and broke the wax seal with a knife she now carried openly on her belt, a good knife with a sharp edge. Not for fighting, but for the simple satisfaction of knowing she had the means to defend herself if defense became necessary. She unfolded the heavy paper and read, "To Miss Grace Holloway, you are hereby appointed clerk and field assistant to the Office of Land and Labor Inspection, Snake River Region, Wyoming Territory. Your duties shall include the examination of labor contracts for compliance with territorial and federal law investigation of complaints regarding working conditions and compensation documentation of violations and liaison work with both settler and tribal communities to ensure fair treatment under the law. Monthly compensation shall be $40 plus reasonable expenses for travel and lodging. You are directed to report to Inspector J. Morrison, Medicine Bow, at your earliest convenience to receive formal instruction in your duties and responsibilities." Grace read the letter 3 times, her eyes moving over the formal language with growing disbelief that gradually transformed into something else. Not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps the understanding that hope was possible again. It was real. It was happening. She would be paid, well paid by territorial standards, to do work that mattered, work that would prevent other women from suffering what she had suffered, work that would give her authority and purpose and a reason to look forward instead of back. But the work would require traveling. Weeks or even months at a time, spent away from the cookhouse, riding between isolated towns and mining camps and tribal territories, often through country that was dangerous, even for men traveling in groups. She would need supplies and horses, and she would need a guide. Someone who knew the land and the people. Someone who could move between white and Lakota communities with equal ease. Someone she trusted absolutely. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the smell of pine smoke and autumn leaves. Nodin came in, and the room seemed to shift subtly around his presence, as though adjusting to accommodate him. He had been gone for 12 days, carrying messages between the territorial capital and the tribal councils. And his return made something in Grace's chest unclench that she had not realized was tight. He saw the letter on the counter and raised an eyebrow in silent question. "The territorial government has offered me a job," Grace said. She picked up the letter and held it out to him, watching his face as he read. "Inspecting labor contracts, investigating complaints, making sure what happened here doesn't happen somewhere else." Snowden read the letter carefully, his dark eyes moving over the words with the focused attention he brought to everything he did. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable, in the way that always meant he was thinking deeply about something. "This is good work," he said finally. "You will do it well. You understand what it means to be trapped by words on paper, and you will not let others be trapped the same way." "It means traveling," Grace said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "A lot of traveling. Between towns and camps and territorial offices. I would need—" She stopped, took a breath, made herself say it plainly. "I would need a guide. Someone who knows the trails and the people. Someone who speaks both English and Lakota and can help me understand what I'm seeing and hearing. Someone I trust." She met his eyes across the counter, across the distance of different worlds and different experiences, and the gulf that should have existed between a Lakota warrior and a white woman who had once been a kitchen slave. But the distance was not as great as it should have been. They had crossed it together, step by step, through fire and violence and shared purpose. They had crossed it in the darkness of a collapsing mine, when he had taught her to breathe through panic. They had crossed it every time they had chosen to stand side by side instead of walking away. Snowden was quiet for a long moment, and Grace felt her heart hammering in her chest, certain that he would refuse, that he had his own life and his own responsibilities, and she was asking too much. Then he smiled, that rare transformative smile that changed his face from something remote and unreadable into something warm and alive and entirely human. "I am not worth much as a guide," he said. And there was something in his voice that might have been humor, or might have been honesty, or might have been both. "I know only this territory, and my English is not always precise. But with the right partner, I think I could help keep this whole region honest and just, if you will have me." Grace felt something tight and painful in her chest finally loosen and dissolve, leaving behind a warmth that spread through her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Partners, then. Partners." Snowden agreed, and the word sounded like a promise. They left Coal Dust 3 weeks later on a morning when frost silvered the grass and the sky stretched blue and infinite overhead, like a promise that the world was larger and more full of possibility than the darkness they had survived might suggest. 2 riders on 2 good horses heading north toward the Snake River and the work that waited beyond. Grace carried the ledger she had kept at the cookhouse, a frying pan strapped to her saddle. Her federal appointment letter folded in her coat pocket, and a revolver on her hip that Dr. Green had taught her to shoot with surprising accuracy. Snowden carried his rifle and his knife, and a leather portfolio containing maps and tribal agreements and letters of introduction from both his uncle the chief and the territorial governor, and together they carried something else, a shared purpose forged in darkness and violence tempered by survival, refined into something that might have been called love, if either of them had been the sort to use such words carelessly. They did not speak of it directly, but it was there in the way Snowden's hand steadied Grace when her horse stumbled on rough ground, in the way Grace divided her food to ensure Snowden ate. When supplies ran low, in the 1,000 small kindnesses and considerations that grew between 2 people who had chosen to face an unjust world side by side rather than surrender to it separately. Behind them, Coal Dust settled into its new shape. Smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, where Louisa Bauer now managed the business with capable hands and a stern expression for any man who tried to take advantage or cause trouble. In the fields beyond town, children played while their parents worked land that belonged to them, not to mining companies or distant investors who cared nothing for the people who broke their backs to extract wealth from the earth. The Silver Knife Saloon had been torn down its timber, used to build a school where both settler and Lakota children would eventually learn to read and write and cipher, not in separate rooms or separate classes, but together, because Dr. Green had insisted on it before he died, and the town had honored his wishes. Ahead, the Snake River ran clear and cold, under a sky so wide it seemed to curve down and embrace the earth at the horizon. Trout flashed silver in the shallows, where the water ran swift over stones smoothed by centuries of patient erosion. Deer came down from the hills to drink, no longer afraid that the water would poison them. And along the banks, willows were beginning to grow again after years of being killed by runoff that would never come again, and their green shoots bright with life and promise. Grace and Noden rode toward that river side by side, their horses' hooves striking a steady rhythm on the hard ground, a sound like a heartbeat, like a promise. Like the first words of a story that was just beginning and would continue long after they were gone. When they reached the Lakota camp 3 days later, when the children ran out to greet Noden, and the elders came to hear what news he brought from the territorial government and what this strange white woman wanted, Grace stood beside him as he translated her words into Lakota, and she translated his words into the language of territorial law and federal authority. They worked together as though they had been doing it for years instead of months, and their partnership so natural and unforced that the elders exchanged knowing glances, and the children giggled behind their hands in the way children do when they see something adults think they are hiding. That night, sitting by the fire while the camp settled into sleep around them, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Noden spoke quietly in Lakota. Grace had been learning the language slowly and imperfectly, struggling with sounds her English tongue had never learned to make. But she understood enough to catch the meaning, if not every word. "In my language," he said, "there is a word. Kola. It means friend, but deeper than the English word friend. It means someone who walks the same path you walk. Someone whose spirit recognizes yours across all the distance between you. Someone you would fight beside and die for if death came calling." Grace looked at him across the fire. This man who had saved her life and then helped her save herself, who had stood beside her when anyone with sense would have run, who had shown her that justice was worth fighting for, even when victory seemed impossible, and the cost seemed too high. "Kola," she repeated, tasting the word, feeling the way it sat in her mouth like something precious and fragile and unbreakably strong all at once. "I like that word." "Good," Noden said, and his smile was visible even in the firelight. "Because there is much work ahead of us. Many contracts to inspect, many towns where the strong prey on the weak and call it business. Many fights we will have to fight together. It will not be easy. Nothing worth doing ever is," Grace said. And she meant it with the same absolute certainty that had carried her through Pike's kitchen and the midnight theft and the collapsing mine and everything else that had brought her to this moment beside this fire with this man. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. And when Grace finally rose to go to the lodge the women had prepared for her, Noden touched her hand briefly, a gesture so small it might have been accidental, except that it was not, except that they both knew it was not. "Sleep well, Kola," he said. "You too," Grace answered, and she carried the warmth of that touch with her into sleep. In the morning, they would ride out again toward the next town, and the next injustice, and the next small battle, in a war that would never truly be won, but was worth fighting all the same. They would ride as partners, as friends, as two people who had found in each other something rare and precious. Not romance in the way that songs were written about it, but something deeper and more enduring. Trust, respect, the absolute knowledge that neither of them would have to face the darkness alone again. The Snake River ran clear under the stars, carrying away the poison and the past, and two riders would carry justice into territories where it had never existed before. The work would be hard and the victories would be small, and there would be setbacks and defeats and moments when the odds seemed impossible. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference.